I'll just use this one. This works just as good. I'm not picky. If you didn't hear me, thank you for being here. What are the things that you say to someone when it could be the final time that you speak to them? If you may never get the chance to say anything else, what things would you say to that person? What would you want your lasting words to be? What things would be most important for you to say to them? Whether it's a loved one who is in their last days, or a soldier getting ready to leave for deployment, or a friend moving across the country, or a patient going in for major surgery and you may or may not know if they'll make it. This is a situation that we have been and will be tasked with in life. So what things do you say in those circumstances? Well, I suppose it depends on the person, and it depends on the circumstances. But for the most part, the things that you say to that person are the most important things that you think that they should hear. Mostly that you love them, or that you support them, or that you're there for them, that you'll miss them, etc. When we come to the end of the book of 1 Chronicles, it seems that King David of Israel is in one of these predicaments. In the last few lessons of this lesson series that we've been in through the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles, we've been looking at some of David's actions in what you could call the twilight years of his reign as king. His focus as king has largely shifted from military conquests to now the building of the house of God. Despite David having wanted to build a house for God, a temple as we think of it, he's not going to be the one to do that, but instead God calls David's son Solomon to that task, Solomon being a man of rest, as we've looked at previously. But that doesn't stop David from doing everything short of actually building the temple. For example, we saw in 1 Chronicles 22 that David began to assemble an excess of materials to be used for the building of the temple. And he even began to assemble qualified people to assist in the building of the temple, men such as stonecutters. After this, the writer of Chronicles spends 5 chapters, chapters 23 through 27, telling of David organizing now the personnel that will be working in the temple, people such as the Levites, the priests, the musicians, the gatekeepers, and so on. And he also organizes the personnel who will be in Israel's military. This has been David's focus, largely, in the twilight years of his reign as Israel's king. Namely, preparing everything he can in order for his successor Solomon, his son, to succeed. And when we come to the last 2 chapters of 1 Chronicles, chapters 28 and 29, David is presumably very near the end of his time as Israel's king. The time of his departure was at hand. And the time for his son Solomon to succeed him on the throne was getting closer and closer. And so if this were you, if you were in King David's shoes, what would you do? Well, in 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 1, we see that David takes it upon himself to call an assembly at Jerusalem. And who it is that he assembles, if you look in that verse, it is all the officials of Israel. And this is a long list of people that he assembles if you read this in verse 1. It says, David assembled at Jerusalem all the officials of Israel, the officials of the tribes, the officers of the divisions that serve the king, the commanders of thousands, the commanders of hundreds, the stewards of all the property and livestock of the king and his sons, together with the palace officials, the mighty men, and all the seasoned warriors. And so we see here that this is no small assembly. It's not small in number, nor is it small in terms of the importance of the people that are there. Anyone who would have had any sort of leadership position in Israel is there. And there are people there who for several decades now have looked to David as their leader and as their king. And now for what might be the final time, David calls them all together. And notice if you have your Bibles open in 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 2, we see that with this crowd assembled together, David rose to his feet. This is no small detail that the writer of Chronicles gives us here. In 1 Kings chapter 1, in that book's portrayal of this sequence of events, the end of David's reign, the beginning of Solomon's reign, David is depicted there at the end of his life as being more or less a frail and feeble old man. It says there, if you read in that chapter, that David was old and advanced in years, and that he could never get warm. So if this is true of David, if David is at this point, if he's at the end of his life and he's this frail and feeble man, for him here in Chronicles to rise to his feet, you can see that this is a significant thing that he does. This couldn't have been an easy thing for this frail and feeble man to do. And so what this tells us is that this is an important thing in David's eyes that he's doing. This has some significance. At this point in his life, he probably didn't rise to his feet all that often. And so this meant something. So what is it that could have meant so much to David that he calls this assembly together and rises to his feet? What could he have to say that would be this important? What could he do that would be worth putting in all of this effort at the age that he's in and in the state that he's in? Commentators are right to point out that the backdrop of this assembly, the big thing that's going on, the thing that's captivated David's attention, was the preparations for the building of the temple of God. This has been the focus, keep in mind, of the last several chapters in 1 Chronicles, and this has been the focus largely of David's last years. And in fact, many commentators will go as far as saying that this is the entire reason that David calls this assembly together, to cement the plans that he's made for the temple, and to proclaim there in this assembly that God has chosen Solomon to be its builder. But when you actually look at what David says and what he does in this assembly, there's much more than just things going on here that pertain to the temple. The temple, it doesn't seem to be David's sole focus, based on the things that he says and that he does. When you look at David's actions in this assembly, it's clear that his concern is not primarily about the temple, although that is a concern of his. It's also clear that despite the fact that his time as king was seemingly coming closer and closer to an end, and Solomon, his son, would be taking his place, David's concern was not about the kingdom either. Rather, based on David's actions, it's clear that his concern is for the spiritual well-being of the people of Israel. Throughout this assembly, and again, this spans chapters 28 and 29 of 1 Chronicles, there are, among a multitude of different things going on, two main themes or threads that come up over and over again throughout these chapters, throughout this assembly, these things that David is doing. And we'll look closely at these threads that saturate this assembly in more detail in a moment. We'll find that these things, these themes throughout this assembly that David calls, these are the things that mattered to David. These are the concerns that he had at that time. These are what mattered to David. These were his priorities. We'll also find that these things that David was so concerned about are the very same things that we ought to be concerned about today, although these concerns may and do manifest themselves in different ways. This assembly that we read of, which took place thousands of years ago, it holds relevance for us today because in those things that were said and done there are principles that are beneficial for us today. So what are the themes and threads of this assembly? What were the things that the frail and feeble David felt were worth standing up and saying to this assembly? Well, the first thread we find that's weaved throughout this assembly pertains to something about God, namely the fact that the providence that God has when it comes to his people. In chapter 28, David gives this charge of sorts to the people of Israel. He gives them something to do. And later he gives another charge to Solomon specifically. But before he gives these charges, he sets it up by speaking of the providential nature of God, even though it is partially at his own expense. For example, in the opening lines of this assembly, among the first things that David says, after he gets their attention, he says, "Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, for the footstool of our God. And I made preparations for building. But God said to me, you may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood." Keep in mind that this is the backdrop of this entire assembly, the building of the house of God, the building of the temple. Here we see an important lesson about the providence of God, namely that his will is not going to always line up with our will. David says that he had it in his heart to build a house for God, and yet God tells David, you're not going to be the one to do this. You're not qualified to do it. There's a lesson here for us, certainly. Sometimes we want to do things and we tell people to follow your heart. The Bible says that the heart is deceitful above all things. We need to be careful about following our hearts. This idea of the providence of God continues in these next few verses in this chapter, when we move then to the call of Solomon. David won't be the one to build the house of God, but it will be Solomon his son. This is part of the message of these few verses, that Solomon will be the builder. But notice that the emphasis, it's not necessarily on Solomon being chosen so much as it is on God choosing him. You can see this drawn out in the fact that not only has God chosen Solomon, but God has chosen others as well, and David fleshes this out. If you look in verses 4 through 7 of chapter 28, the word chose or chosen is used 4 times, and it's inferred in other places as well. That should tell us something as to what David is trying to say. What it tells us is the emphasis isn't on the ones being chosen, but rather on the one who's doing the choosing, and the fact that he is choosing. In these verses, starting in verse 4, it says, "Yet the Lord God of Israel chose me from all my father's house to be king over Israel forever. For he chose Judah as leader, and in the house of Judah my father's house. And among my father's sons he took pleasure in me to make me king over all Israel. And of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen Solomon my son to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, it is Solomon your son, who shall build my house and my courts. For I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. I will establish his kingdom forever, if he continues strong in keeping my commandments and my rules as he is today." And so here David speaks to the fact that not only has God chosen Solomon, that's perhaps the main point that he's making, but God has also chosen David to be king. He chose the tribe of Judah to be the tribe that rules. Remember what he said in Genesis, that the scepter will not depart from Judah. We see from the tribe of Judah, God had chosen the house of Jesse, David's father. Over and over, we see that God is at work. He chose Judah, he chose Jesse, he chose David, and now he chooses Solomon. David shows us here that God's fingerprint is everywhere when it comes to who the leader of his people was going to be. Later in chapter 29, as David is praying before the assembly, after the people had given willingly and made these offerings to the Lord and to his temple, David has the perspective to realize that these things that the people have given, they come from God. So really they're giving God the things that are rightly his. He puts it this way in verse 14 of that chapter, 1 Chronicles 29, when he says, "But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you." Later in verse 16, David says, O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a house for your holy name comes from your hand and is your own. When speaking of the providence of God, there are two aspects of that, and you can see it in the way that this word is used. First, we have his divine foreknowledge and his involvement in orchestrating events, pulling the strings, so to speak. But then there's also the aspect of the generosity that God gives. How God provides. You can see provide there in the word providence. He provides for his people. And that is specifically what we see David bringing out in the prayer that he gives in chapter 29. The things that they were able to give, they were only able to do so because God had given them these things in the first place. That certainly speaks to us today. This message of the providence of God that we see weave throughout this assembly, this is something that spoke not only to that audience, but it also speaks to God's people today. We live in a world today that is stirred up with all sorts of chaotic events and circumstances. For many of us, it seems that anything that can go wrong does go wrong. We're uncertain about our future. Perhaps that's true individually, collectively, as a nation, collectively as a congregation. We're unsure of things. We're distressed over the way that things are going. And in a world that seems like it's spinning every which way, in a life that seems perhaps sometimes that the system is rigged against us, it's important for us to remember that above all, we serve a God who is in control and who has providence over his people. Any sincere person with hindsight through a trying experience can tell you that the words of the Apostle Paul in Romans 8 and verse 28 are true. That for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. It doesn't say that all things will be good, because they're not. But rather, it says that they will work together for good. I'm frequently reminded of this fact when looking at my own life experiences, and I'm sure others of you can say the same thing. Knowing this about God, that in his providence he is in control and he continues to bless his people, we come now to the second thread that's weaved throughout this assembly, which pertains now to God's people. And the thread is this: how will God's people respond to what God has done? This, in a nutshell, is David's chief concern in calling together this assembly. Before his time of departure, David wanted to be sure to leave both the people of Israel and also his son Solomon specifically with instructions as to how they are to live their life in regards to God. David, as their king, he was not only their political leader, he was also their spiritual leader. And he wanted to be assured that they could continue to be faithful to God in his absence. And with that in mind, David gives this charge to the leaders of Israel that were in that assembly. This comes in chapter 28 and verse 8, where he says, Now therefore, in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, observe and seek out all the commandments of the Lord your God. There's a few things that are worth pointing out here in this charge that he gives. First, notice who David issues this charge before. It's in the presence of who? Who the witnesses are of this charge. It's before Israel, which he calls here the assembly of the Lord. And it's also in the hearing of their God. The Hebrew text literally reads, before the ears of God. And he does this, of course, to encourage their compliance in what he's going to say. And what he tells them is this: observe and seek out all the commandments of the Lord Jehovah your God. This is what was so important that a frail, feeble King David called an assembly together and stood up to speak to them. This is what he wanted to leave his people with as he spoke to them for what may very well have been the final time. Observe and seek the commandments of God. What lasting words for his people. Later, when David charges Solomon, he says in verse 9 of that chapter, "And you, Solomon, my son, know the God of your father, and serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind." Before, when he addressed the whole assembly, the emphasis was on obeying God and seeking his commands. But here to Solomon, it's to know God relationally, know him, and serve him. Of course, these more or less are saying the same thing. If you obey God's commands with sincerity, and not with legalism as the practice was in the first century with the Jews, as you read in the gospel accounts, if you obey God's commands with sincerity, then you will know him. And if you know God and are serving him, you will keep his commandments. These two go together. In fact, really, you can't separate them from each other. Notice also how David tells Solomon to know and to serve God with a whole heart and with a willing mind. This speaks of not only the act of knowing and serving God, but also the dedication with which Solomon is supposed to do it. This isn't some lackadaisical thing. This isn't something that is to be done half-heartedly. Rather, it's to be done with his whole heart and with a willing mind. David calls for Solomon to be all in. In chapter 29, David, speaking to the assembly, starts talking about all of the things that he has gathered and that he's contributed for the building of the temple. And he's gathered quite a lot of things. He predicates all of this by stating in verse 1 of that chapter that this palace, this isn't going to be something built for man, but rather it's built for God. This is going to be his house. And so because of this, and because of the importance of that, because also of Solomon's youth and his inexperience, which he brings up again, David takes it upon himself to make all of these preparations for it. He assembles the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, the wood, the onyx, so on and so forth. He lists the things that he's provided. And in addition to all of that, David also points out the contributions that he's made from his own possessions. He does this, as he says in verse 3, because of his devotion to the house of God. And so he gives, as he lists in verse 4, he gives 3,000 talents of gold, 7,000 talents of silver. These are the things that David personally contributed. These aren't things he assembled under his capacity as king. These came personally from David. And then in verse 5, David turns this outwardly to the assembly. And he asks them, who then will offer willingly, consecrating himself today for the Lord? This is a big ask for David. He can tell that based on how he phrases this. Because in asking the assembly to offer things to go toward the temple, notice he doesn't ask them to consecrate, and that word means to set apart their stuff. He doesn't say consecrate your stuff, but rather he asks them to consecrate themselves to the Lord. In willingly making an offering toward the temple, David is asking for much more than their stuff. He's asking for the devotion of their very selves. And to the assembly's credit, they do just as David asks. In verses 6 through 8 of chapter 29, we read of the great multitude of the things that they gathered together and offered for the building of the temple, giving things like gold and silver and bronze and iron and precious stones. And in doing so, they've not only consecrated these things, but they've consecrated themselves because of how willingly they made these offerings. In verse 9, the writer of Chronicles puts it this way. Then the people rejoiced because they had given willingly. For with a whole heart, there's that phrase again, with a whole heart they had offered freely to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. You see, what God was after, it wasn't their stuff. It was their hearts. In giving all of those things to go toward the temple, they had given themselves. by giving with a whole heart and offering freely to the Lord. There's no record of them saying, oh, well, we better check the budget and make sure we have this much. There's no record of that here. They gave freely, and they rejoice in doing so, and David rejoices along with them. And you can't help but wonder, as this assembly was beginning, if when David first rose to his feet, if he wondered if all of this would be worth it. I'd imagine at the end he didn't have any doubts. These things that we see in David's charge to the assembly, in his charge to Solomon, and in the offerings that are made by the assembly, these things should be the natural result of knowing God, knowing who God is, and knowing what God has done for us, His people. In light of God being the creator of all things, the author of life itself, the almighty and all-powerful one, and in light of all that God had done for Israel, leading them out of Egypt, leading them through the wilderness, leading them into the promised land, feeding them, sustaining them through all of that, and also in light of the many ways that God had blessed them, Israel should have given willingly and with a whole heart, and to their credit, they did just that. And the same thing rings true today for us. Although our context is different than theirs, you can still see some truth here. We don't have a physical temple that's going to be built to contribute toward, but we do have a spiritual one that's already been built and continues to be built up today, speaking, of course, of the church. And God didn't lead us out of Egypt or through the wilderness and into the promised land, but He has freed us from a different kind of slavery than what the Israelites had in Egypt. He's freed us from the slavery or the bondage of sin. And there is, of course, a promised land that awaits us in the life after this one. And the way that God has done this for us is by way of sending His one and only Son, Jesus, the Christ, to this earth, and eventually sending Him to a cruel cross at Calvary. Jesus went to that cross and He died there, dying the death that you and I deserve in our place. Through His death, through the shedding of His own blood, we can have the hope of everlasting life. This is what God has done for us through Jesus. So the question is, how will we respond? Will we give our life to Him? Will we observe and seek out all the commandments of the Lord? Will we know God and serve Him with a whole heart and a willing mind? Will we offer willingly and consecrate ourselves to the Lord? For many of us here this morning, this question has already been answered with a resounding yes. But for others, perhaps that question still needs to be answered. And I want you to know this is a question that cannot be avoided. All of us, when confronted with the gospel, with the good news of salvation that comes from Jesus, we must give an answer. What stops you from giving your answer today? If this is you, or if you have any other spiritual needs, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.